Today we are going to be looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of both armies fighting during the Revolutionary War, the British Army and the Continental Army. If you would, please record this chart in your composition book, record strengths and weaknesses in the corresponding columns, and be prepared to share and discuss tomorrow. At the close of the 18th century, the British Army and military was the most powerful military in the entire world. In fact, they were spread across the entire world, fighting battles as far away as China and India. They were extremely well equipped, they were disciplined, and they had the strongest navy almost the world had ever seen up to this point. Most people could not stand toe-to-toe with the British Army. The closest would be the French. However, we know the French are not necessarily the best military power. The British Army was the most powerful army in the world, having fought wars on 5 continents. The soldiers who were in the British Army were well trained, they were well equipped, and they had modern, up-to-date weapons. They were hardened by discipline and, most importantly, war. All of these soldiers who were fighting in the colonies had seen action before, so therefore they knew the discipline on how to move on a battlefield. They were not gun-shy, and they were ready to fight. Also, the British Army, or the British military, had the high seas locked down. The colonial military could not withstand the British Navy. Now, where the British Army had a lot of strengths, just like any army, they had their weaknesses. First off, the Americans were more accurate shots. They had something called a Kentucky rifle with a rifled barrel, where the British were firing what was called a Brown Bess, which had a smooth bore. The British carried 3 days of provisions on them, which is great because they have food, however, it's very heavy. Their gear weighed on average 100 pounds everywhere they went, and this meant it didn't go anywhere when you got into actual fighting. Also, their supply lines were 3,000 miles long over the ocean, and we know messages took about 2 months to get from one side of the ocean to the other. British officers were also resigned to fight in straight-line formations with the conventions of 18th century warfare, leaving their soldiers exposed to be hit by enemy fire. Now, the Americans were very overmatched. However, they did have some advantages. First off, the accuracy of their rifle, known as a Kentucky hunting rifle. They had knowledge of their own land, and they used guerrilla warfare tactics, which is something much different than the British style of fighting. They had superb commanders, and then in the end, they would get foreign help from the Spanish, the French, and some other various European countries. Now, just like in sports, home field advantage is very important when fighting a war. The Revolutionary Army, or the Continental Army, knew the lay of the land, and so they used irregular or guerrilla warfare. This is warfare where you hide behind trees, behind rocks, behind fences, and you shoot from a covered spot instead of fighting out in the open like the British would. They used a weapon called the Kentucky rifle, and they also used Native American tomahawks. The Kentucky rifle had a rifled barrel, which is spirals within inside the barrel of the gun that make the musket ball shoot straighter because it spirals it. They wore different uniforms, which essentially camouflaged them and made it more difficult for a British soldier to pick them out in the dense foliage of the east coast of North America. Now, the major weaknesses of the Continental Army was in essence a navy. They had no navy to speak of. At the offset of the war, they had 3 frigates, or 3 ships. They lacked regular supply lines. Oftentimes they would have to resort to pillaging and eating throughout the country or what people would give them. They generally did not have training, and especially even if they had normal militia training, they had never seen battle. And this is something that cannot be overstated, the importance of being battle hardened, not getting frightened when somebody's shooting at you. And then also, soldiers fight for pay, even if they are fighting for freedom. And generally speaking, many revolutionary soldiers never got paid. Now, oftentimes the British soldiers were confounded with their colonial counterparts because fighting them faced completely new challenges. For one, they didn't use conventional 18th century warfare, which was essentially standing in lines and shooting at each other until you charged each other and stabbed each other with bayonets. And this is seen by a soldier who says, "Damn those Americans, they will not stand and fight." Also, they felt that if they were going to the Americas, it was more or less of a death sentence, as seen as in the second quote, "Settle your affairs before leaving for the colonies because you're not going to come back." The British hated serving in the American colonies. Now, American leadership really set it apart from the British, especially because these people had something to fight for, because if they did not win, most of them would be executed. For instance, George Washington, he was the commander of all American forces, also a very wealthy landowner. He understood the risk involved. He also knew that anything that he was not good at, he would pick somebody in order to help him. Nathaniel Greene was the top strategist for the military, and in essence, he decided to fight a defensive war which had to do with running away and constantly retreating. Benedict Arnold would become an inspiration to all Americans, unfortunately, before he turns traitor after the Battle of Saratoga. Now, the British leaders were not very happy, and so therefore they were not nearly as good as the American leaders. General Charles Cornwallis, or Lord Cornwallis as he is known, was a military genius. However, he was outfought constantly by Nathaniel Greene because Nathaniel Greene's army would not stand and fight. General John Burgoyne was something of a prima donna, meaning that he liked to travel with thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of things that the army did not need for their general survival. Benedict Arnold, who was an incredibly capable general who originally fought for the Americans, was a traitor for the Americans and eventually fought on the British side. All of these men considered the Americas the worst place possible to serve. Most of them would rather have gone to India or anywhere else in the world. Now, the American Revolution very much becomes a world war, with many Europeans sending over people to help France, Spain, Germany, and Poland. Hessians were mercenaries, meaning people who fought strictly for pay and not loyalty, who would fight on the British side. Soldiers from a German king or German prince who would fight to help the British. Marquis de Lafayette, the guy seen in the picture here, was a French nobleman who, when he was 19 years old, traveled to the Americas and volunteered for the colonial army, so enthralled with the ideas of the revolution. Essentially, the Americans, in a lot of ways, have the Marquis to thank for winning because he is the man who encouraged the French to eventually give them gunpowder, give them shot, and most importantly, give them a navy. Other foreigners who fought for the Americans were Bernardo de Galvez, who was a Spanish lord in Mexico who was instrumental in taking Louisiana and specifically New Orleans from the British. Baron Frederick von Steuben was a German military commander who was kicked out of the German military, who trained the Continental Army. He, in essence, took them from a ragtag militia or volunteer army and turned them into a real fighting force. Now, George Washington is also known for having an extensive spy network through New York and other loyalist areas. And one of the most famous spies was Nathan Hale, and he's most known for his last words before he's hung by the British: "I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." The biggest disadvantage that the Americans had was their navy. Now, it wasn't for lack of trying. 3,000 men enlist in the American Navy, but the American Navy consisted of 13 ships. Now, we know that the Americans shipped quite a bit for commerce, but they did not have warships. The British, however, had tons. Most, if not all, of their frigates were destroyed or captured during the conflict. Now, the colonial navy was authorized by the Continental Congress as early as October 13, 1775. Now, even though it was built up throughout the war, it could never stand up to the British Navy, because the British Navy was the most powerful navy in the entire world. The colonists essentially needed the help of France in order to stand up to the British. Now that you have finished watching, I hope you enjoyed it. Please continue adding any specific details to British strengths and weaknesses and Continental strengths and weaknesses. Also, on the next page, I would like you to write down 3 questions that you have for Mr. Wilson from this lecture to be shared tomorrow in class. Thank you very much, and I will see you tomorrow.